That is always such a great way to just fill us up, right? Listening to that music by our incredible musicians here. Thank you all so much. My name is Rachel. I am one of the seminarians here at Broad Street. When I was in high school, my summer job was working at the local zoo. And one of my favorite places that they put me most often was our butterfly pavilion. And most of the time, my job was to teach the kids and the other folks who came to the zoo about the little creatures that were fluttering around in there. And it was a really beautiful place. When you walked in on a bright, sunny Nebraskan summer afternoon, you could just see colors flapping around in front of you, different shapes and sized butterflies. It was gorgeous. But every couple weeks or so, we would get a shipment of these big boxes that weighed next to nothing, and my job description changed pretty drastically. Instead of teaching people about butterflies, I was carefully unwrapping these really delicate chrysalises. We would get new butterflies shipped to us when they were still all wrapped up inside their chrysalises. And I would glue them this is actually what you do, this is what you're supposed to do. You glue them to these display cases so that they're still hanging the way that they would naturally. And I would glue them in these little lines in this display case so that the kids who came to the zoo could watch as they went through their process of transformation. And so after I put each little tiny chrysalis in this line in this display case, we would wait and wait and wait. And different kinds of butterflies, different species take different times to emerge. But eventually, those chrysalises would start to crack, and then this floppy little wet mess of a butterfly would crawl out. When butterflies emerge from the chrysalis, their wings aren't like all pumped up and ready to fly yet, and they look kind of messy and kind of funny. And so we would watch them then as they took their first little stretches of wings and they pumped them up. And once they were ready and strong enough to fly, I would go back into the back room and get them out of the display case, and then bring them into the butterfly pavilion and wait until they took off and flew for the first time. And there is an undeniable magic about watching a butterfly fly for the first time. But the real magic began before those wings hit that sunshine. It began in the darkness of the chrysalis, right? These caterpillars climb up somewhere, attach themselves and wrap themselves up so thoroughly until they are encased in a darkness of their own making. Right? And then everything that once made that caterpillar a caterpillar dissolves. They become goop. They become just a mess of molecules and cells and all sorts of things swimming around in there. It is quite a formless void. A potential place, but pretty chaotic in there. And then somehow, miraculously, all of those things that once made a caterpillar rearrange themselves and find a new way of being and become the butterfly that eventually emerges from that chrysalis. But that new life begins in darkness. I like to think that the goop that's inside of that chrysalis might have looked something like what God saw in the reading that we heard today, when the Spirit of God hovered over the formless void that was our universe before creation began. That chaotic potential there. And the scripture tells us that not only was God hovering over the face of the deep, but that darkness covered the face of the deep. The text that we read today is often labeled as creation of light, or at least it is in my study Bible. But we could just as easily consider this text to be called creation from darkness. This is not a popular opinion. We live in a culture that is radically dependent on light. We are fixated on it. We have found ways to be in the light all the time, cities that never sleep, and a world that suffers from light pollution at this point, right? We have this dependence on the light. And it's not just our modern society that has this dependence on light. We have been obsessed with light for a very long time. When St. Augustine in the 4th century read the beginning of Genesis, He was so appalled at the concept that God might have been in darkness for even like a smidgen of a second that he wrote, God dwelt in supernal light before creating a different physical light. Right? He had to explain some way because he found it unfathomable that God and darkness might coexist. We also live in a similar culture that has an issue with seeing God in darkness. We live in a visual culture where our sight or our idea of sight is tied up in the way that we understand everything. After all, seeing is believing, right? Everything that we know, we use language of sight to explain. My point of view, your perspective, right? We are very tied into the idea that we have to see a thing to know a thing, to understand a thing. And so, if we need light to see, do we not also need light to believe? How many of our prayers and our songs and even our scriptures dwell on light, right? We're the children of light, we're walking in the light with this little light of mine. We are fixated on light. We treasure light. But there are gifts in darkness, too. On Friday, I went to a coffee shop to try and put all of these thoughts into some words. And when I walked in, I saw a new art installation in this shop that I've been going to. And it struck me because it was a series called Seeing in the Dark by Serena Neasley. And they were silhouettes of people framed by the night sky or framing the night sky. And it just seemed so perfect that that would be the thing that greeted me when I went to write this sermon. And then the next day, even more serendipitously, I went to an art shop, an art show, and that artist was there. And she and I got to actually talk about her process and her inspiration for the work that she did. And I am going to read her artist statement because I think it's an incredible and different way of understanding darkness than we tend to hear. She says, "It has become a ritual of mine on the first night of daylight savings to go for a walk in the night. At that time of year and for the many dark months to come, it feels as though evening clamps down around the walls of dwellings like an iron cage. Going out, penetrating the solid wall of darkness, reminds me that it is breakable, and that the world goes on. The river is moving, the branches of the trees are swaying, the moon wanes, waxes, and the clouds pass over the sky, even in the midwinter dark. This heavy darkness is not a monolith as it seemed, and in its expansiveness, I am suddenly dwarfed. There is a familiar and exhilarating comfort visiting this wild and solitary place, facing my smallness in and simultaneous connection to the moving world." What a different perspective on darkness. And yet, so often we are still afraid of the dark. And the darkness can be scary because it strips us of the illusion that we can know everything. That if we just search hard enough, we'll figure it all out, and once we figure it out, we can control it. The darkness strips us of that illusion. We live in an Enlightenment world, and notice the core of that word is light, Enlightenment. Believing that reason and rationality are more reliable than our feelings, our emotions, our physical senses, right? Light has come to symbolize goodness, hope, happiness, even God. And it's something that we say that we long for, wait for, hope for, strive for, look towards. And because we, in our culture, just love binary systems, we have made darkness not just different than light, but the opposite of light. And not only the opposite, but the opposite in a hierarchical way. So darkness has come to symbolize the antithesis of light: evil, fear, embodiment, things that are not of God. And yet, here we are in Advent, in the darkest time of the year, a season that is meant to be dark and holy. And we are waiting. Most of the time we often think about this season as the time that we are waiting for God, but Jesus was born 2,000 years ago, and God was here even before that. We are not waiting for God. God is already here. We are waiting with God in the darkness. And the darkness is holy too. In the beginning, the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, where the Spirit of God hovered. God created the universe out of darkness. And God brought in light not because darkness is bad, but because both are necessary. We need that cycle. We need both dark and light. Life itself began in the dark, and life continues to recreate itself in the dark all the time, like those caterpillars that go into their chrysalises and become butterflies, or like seeds that are planted in the dark earth of the ground and come to sprout in that darkness, right? Even we begin our life in the darkness of the womb, and the resurrection began in the darkness of a tomb. Life is born from darkness all the time. And that darkness is not inherently bad. It can be intimidating, but it can also be protective, creative, nourishing, beautiful. Darkness is a place where we are more embodied than logical, more experiential than rational, more creative than deductive, more alive than alert. Advent is a time of waiting, but if all we're doing is looking forward to something that's coming, we miss the gifts of the darkness here and now. And we miss that God is hovering in this darkness alongside of us. So what if instead of enlightenment, we embraced endarkenment? How would endarkenment change our relationship with the earth? Could we, like that artist Serena, see the interconnectedness of all life and creation, including ourselves? How would it change our relationship with our bodies? Could we feel the inner workings of who we are, the things that make us who we are and keep us alive, that are capable of all different kinds of creation? How would endarkenment change our relationship with God? Could we embrace mystery rather than seeing it as a problem to be solved? Could we come to terms with our limited capacity for knowledge and our divine capacity for connection? Could we feel God's fluttering wings at our side? What would this dark awakening mean for our relationship with one another? What hierarchies might crumble? What binaries might converge? What new life could we create together in the darkness? Amen. We are now going to move, we forgot to put it in your bulletins, but we are now going to move into a time for some of this experiential spirituality, this embracing the darkness through prayer stations. So if you look back that way, you will see that there are 4 different prayer stations set up, and each one of them has instructions or someone who will provide you instructions for what to do there. But we are hoping that you take this time, as you feel so moved, so called, to go and experience your spirituality through whatever form of devotion or prayer suits you. So you are now invited to meander that way for about 10 to 15 minutes, something around there. And then when we start hearing the song of response is when we'll all come back here to our chairs together.